My name is Eve Zimmerman. I'm director of the Newhouse Center, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Julie Walsh to you. As many of you know, Professor Walsh is a member of Wellesley's philosophy department, and I was interested to see that she has written articles on no less a seminal thinker than John Locke, one entitled Locke on Power and Freedom, and another, Locke, the Law of Nature and Polygamy. However, this past summer, can you hear me? Yeah. This past summer, Julie worked on a different thinker who has intrigued her over the past decade. One I have never heard of, Nicolas, Malebranche, a French priest and a rationalist philosopher whose life spanned portions of the 17th and 18th centuries. While, of course, I leave it to Professor Walsh to flesh out the figure of Malebranche, as it were, his writings and his thought, I would note that the project she will discuss with us today is part of a general drift in her work away from the canonical early modern thinkers to underrepresented and understudied figures on the margins. Professor Walsh is fairly new to Wellesley, having arrived here in 2015 from Montreal, where she was assistant professor of philosophy at the Université de Québec of Montreal. So sorry about the accent. She also has the distinction of being awarded not one, but 2 long-term research fellowships from the Social Science Research Council of Canada. I am looking forward to Julie's talk today, Nicolas Malebranche, Eve and the Fall of Eden, partly for the obvious reason of my own name, but also because Julie's project opens up and complicates what we think of as the male-dominated 17th and 18th centuries. At least when I studied intellectual history in college, that's the way it was taught to me. So without further ado and great pleasure, I give you Professor Walsh.
Thank you so much. It's really a distinct pleasure to be talking with you all today. Any day I get to talk about Malebranche is my favorite day, so here we are. Nicolas Malebranche, Eve and the Fall of Eden, what discussions of Eve can tell us about early modern misogyny. Okay, so always a good, I do philosophy, I do history, I work on divine grace, I work on human freedom. Never a bad idea to start with a why do we care kind of motivator for the talk. So in the first place, here we sit at a women's college. Why are there women's colleges at all? Well, until relatively recently, women were not permitted to attend college. It was restricted to men. In the mid-1800s, there was a surge of women's institutions that came into being, and while there are fewer in operation today than there were then, the existence of places like Wellesley reminds us of a time when women were systematically excluded from the opportunity to gain knowledge. So thinking of a time before women were granted access to education forces us, I think, to consider the history of sexism. For my part, I'm interested in the philosophical history of sexism. The titans of medieval and early modern philosophy participated in the perpetuation of the view that women were intellectually and even morally inferior. But also, some of us are Malebranche scholars. So for me, as a Malebranche scholar, and someone who's invested in disrupting the idea that the history of philosophy is nothing more than white European men talking about metaphysics and epistemology, and much less frequently, sometimes politics, and even less frequently, ethics, I think it's important to think carefully about the philosophical legacy of misogynistic writing. So I'm not committed to showing that Malebranche was one of the good guys, but I am committed on getting clear on exactly what he said. And as I'll mention below, recent commentators have lumped Malebranche into the category of irredeemable sexists of the 17th century. And I want to challenge this idea with a more comprehensive reading of what he actually says. So part of the danger of thinking of the history of philosophy as a monolith of thinkers and problems is that we tend to skip over certain parts of their writings. For example, it is only very recently that commentators have taken notice that thinkers like Malebranche actually said some stuff about women. So taking notice and taking seriously, these weren't just diversions in between thinking about the forms and thinking about God and thinking about ideas and epistemology. Taking seriously what they say about women is important for painting a full picture of the constellation of ideas and problems that motivated philosophical discussion in the period. And so why is it important to get clear on what Malebranche in particular said? Well, people read him. He was incredibly famous in his own time, and even more, I think, to the point here with respect to what I want to talk about, women in the late 17th century and the beginning of the Enlightenment read him. And I can't here and now explain or show the scope of his influence on women in the period, but it's clear that he had one. And what he wrote about women would have certainly interested and possibly influenced the women of the Enlightenment. So what I see in Malebranche is that his writings on women reveal an acknowledgement of something like the social determinants of intelligence. And this is really interesting. In other words, he seems to recognize that women are less intelligent than men because of a lack of opportunity and access, and not because of a natural or inherent lack of ability to learn and to know. If I'm right, Malebranche's work represents an important moment in the history of men's changing views about women. And this result helps us to better understand the philosophical legacy of sexism and its connection to attitudes about women's education. In order to get at Malebranche's treatment of women, we first need to see what he says about Eve. Not Eve Zimmerman. The other Eve, we call her. Throughout medieval and early modern discussions of women, Eve's role in original sin is used to ground further claims about women's moral and intellectual inferiority more generally. So in order to see where Malebranche is coming from in his discussion of Eve, we need to see who his influences were saying about her. And so the plan for this talk is as follows. So I want to start by just giving a background view about medieval thinkers, the people who influenced Malebranche, and what they said about Eve. Then I want to move to what Malebranche himself says about Eve. Next, what Malebranche says about women more generally, his contemporaries. And then finally, try to make sense of bringing together what he says about Eve and what he says about women, and actually make a claim for a Malebranchian-inspired argument for the moral imperative to educate women. Okay, so introductions. Who's this guy? Okay, Malebranche. As Eve mentioned, late 17th century, early 18th century thinker. He was a French Oratorian priest, which is an order of Catholic Society of Apostolic Life of Catholic priests founded in 1611 in Paris. And I just did a quick Google search. They are still in operation, a much smaller order these days, but still in operation. Despite his great fame in his own time, his star dimmed kind of through the 18th century and kind of almost extinguished, I would say, through the 19th century. And then in the mid-20th century, French thinkers in particular took up his system again. And I think this is in part due to a 20-volume publication by the Parisian publishing house Vrin of the critical edition of his works in French. Between 1958 and 1986, they issued this series of work, which made his work accessible to us. And then in 1980, the first critical English translation of Malebranche's magnum opus, The Search After Truth, was published by the Ohio State Press, and then reissued in paperback by Cambridge University Press in 1997. And it was really this reissuing that introduced Malebranche to the Anglophone world. And I have to just mention that my beloved PhD supervisor, Thomas Lennon, was the one who translated it. So just a little, have to mention that. Okay, thank you, Tom. So Malebranche was a close follower of René Descartes, a very influential rationalist thinker in Europe at the time. St. Agustin, much older medieval thinker, and St. Thomas Aquinas, the kind of titan of Christian philosophical thought in the medieval period. Malebranche was famous, or depending on who you ask, infamous, for trying to synthesize Descartes' view with Augustin's view. So in short, he thought Descartes was great, but like not religious enough. So he brought in Augustin to try to pump up the theology of Descartes' works. And I'll just mention Malebranche is best known for his causal doctrine of occasionalism and his epistemological doctrine of the vision of all things in God. I won't say more about these here, but happy to talk more about them in the Q&A or later. Okay, so Eve, on your left, made from Adam's rib, thus subordinate and inferior, source of original sin, and cause of generational inheritance of the stain of original sin, which manifests itself in many ways, one of which for women in particular is the pain of childbirth. So there were lots and lots and lots of philosophical discussions about Eve and her role in the fall throughout the medieval period. And when Malebranche came to consider Eve in the 17th century, the philosophical marketplace of ideas already contained many arguments about what happened in the Garden of Eden and why Eve did what she did. So in order to understand the philosophical context for Malebranche's thinking around Eve's transgression, I want to take a moment to look at some of the most prominent treatments of Eve from Malebranche's medieval influences. So we'll start with St. Augustine. So as I mentioned a moment ago, Agustin was one of Malebranche's most important influences when he set out to develop his philosophical system. And here's an example of a piece of writing that illustrates what Agustin thinks about Eve's role in the fall. So notice that Agustin states that the fallen angel, Satan, tries his deceit first on Eve because she is the weaker part of the human alliance. And moreover, that Satan believes that Adam is less likely to listen to or be deceived by Satan, but is more likely to yield to the error of Eve. We cannot, Augustine writes, believe that Adam would believe the devil and thus transgress God's law. But Adam, it seems, could not bear to be alone, could not bear to be severed from his only companion, and this is why he yielded to Eve. So from this passage, we can take away that Augustine thinks that first, Eve was the weaker of the two, and second, that Adam's motivation in yielding to Eve involves not wanting to be lonely. St. Thomas Aquinas is another medieval thinker who exerted a huge influence on especially Christian philosophers throughout the early modern period, and still exerts enormous influence on philosophical theology today. And as I mentioned, while Malebranche's system is primarily a synthesis of Augustinian and Cartesian thought, the influence of Aquinas is everywhere in his text, even if he's less willing to explicitly say so. So in this passage from Aquinas' great work, the Summa, we see his assessment of the degree of sinning on the part of Eve. So we see that Aquinas states first that if we consider the natures of Adam and Eve, Adam's sin must be considered more serious because he was more perfect than Eve. So already here we have an indication of a hierarchy of excellence between the sexes. Eve is inherently less perfect than Adam. However, Aquinas goes on to say that despite the difference in perfection, we can actually see that Eve's sin was worse than Adam's. This is because Eve was more puffed up with pride than Adam. Eve not only sinned herself, but also suggested sin to Adam. And that Adam's sin is diminished in grievousness because he consented to Eve out of a certain friendly goodwill. That is, because Adam did not want to make an enemy of his friend, his only friend, Eve. Yeah, I know. Oh. So despite the fact that Adam is more perfect than Eve and presumably should have known better and or been able to do better or be better, Eve is actually more at fault than Adam because she was more prideful. She sinned and then led Adam to sin. And because Adam's sin, as opposed to Eve's, was motivated by a friendly goodwill and not wanting to make an enemy of Eve. So here we see Aquinas echoing Augustin's writing from 800 years earlier. Adam did not wish to be lonely, and that was his motivation to yield to Eve. So why was Eve more puffed up with pride? According to Aquinas, a woman is defective and misbegotten. When generation, that is reproduction, meets with no defect, obstacle, or outside influence, a male baby is created. When there is a defect, a female baby is created. However, when we consider the reason for which women are made, our teleology, the reason why we're here, Aquinas states that with respect to human nature in general, women are not misbegotten, but are rather included in the great machinery of nature because of our purpose, procreation. So it was necessary for Eve to be made in order to be a helper to Adam, but Aquinas is clear, her help is relegated to one domain, generation, which Adam could not do alone. So here we see Aquinas claiming that there's an essential difference between Adam and Eve, between men and women. Woman is naturally subject to man because in man, the discretion of reason dominates. For women, whose role in nature is to incubate further future generations, reason does not dominate their actions. Eve, and by extension women in general, help insofar as they participate in the work of generation. That is all. So from our medieval thinkers, we get the notions that women are weaker, are in some sense misbegotten and defective, exist for the sake of generation, and are subject to men because men are reason-driven and they are not. Moreover, we get the notion that despite the fact that Adam is more perfect than Eve, and thus presumably should have been able to resist the temptation of sin, Eve's sin is worse than Adam's because she was more prideful, and in leading Adam to sin, she effectively sins twice. Finally, Adam's sin is not seen as the sin of giving in to Satan, but rather giving in to Eve because he did not want to displease her and thus possibly be alone. So these are the kinds of ideas with which Malebranche would have been familiar when he set out to consider Eve, women, and their relative perfection, goodness, badness, ability to reason, and so on. But at the outset, I mentioned that Malebranche was greatly influenced by one other thinker, Descartes. So what does Descartes say about Eve and women? Nothing. So, well, I should say pretty much, well, actually, no, nothing, but present-day feminists are utterly split on whether Descartes is friend or foe to the feminist project. So Cartesian metaphysics exalts the rational mind and disparages the body. So people who see Descartes as friend of feminism say, the mind has no sex. Great. All minds are the same. That's friendly to feminism. Other feminists, contemporary feminists, say, no, hold on. Anything associated with the body, according to Descartes, is bad. And of course, women are utterly associated with the body. And so Descartes is bad for feminism. I won't say more about Descartes here and now, but we can talk more about this in the Q&A. The fact that Descartes is silent on this topic, I think, speaks volumes. Okay. So what does Malebranche say about Eve? We'll wait for a moment here. So on Malebranche's view, when Adam and Eve succumbed to temptation, their brains were utterly transformed. So they received such deep traces on their brains that they were passed down to future generations. So Malebranche states that just as animals reproduce animals that resemble them, not just in genotype, he thinks, but also in sympathies and antipathies, so too do humans. This means that all humans are born with a dominant inclination towards sensible things, sensible pleasures. This great distance between ourselves and God, Malebranche thinks, is inherited from our biological parents, but its ultimate origin is with our first parents. Adam and Eve sinned, and we are still inheriting the physiological effects of that sin. But here's a problem. How can Malebranche explain why Adam sinned? This is a very particular problem for Malebranche because, on his view, Adam and God were very close. Adam, like us, experienced sensations like hunger, thirst, fatigue. His sensory perceptions signal to him things in his environment that will help him stay alive, things that will hurt him, and so he should flee from. So Adam's sensory information told him about his environment, just like it tells us. However, unlike us, Malebranche thinks that Adam was not excited by involuntary impulses. He even, Malebranche says, erased from his mind the ideas of sensible things when he so wished, whether he was making use of them or not. So picture Adam doing the Pythagorean theorem, feels a pang of hunger, he can tell that hunger to go away. He can control his body in that way and come back to hunger when the theorem is complete. So Malebranche writes, Adam could in certain instances suspend the natural law of the communication of motion, because he was without concupiscence and because he experienced no involuntary or rebellious impulses within him. So the word concupiscence here is playing a kind of technical role. So often I think today when you see the word concupiscence, it usually means lust. In these discussions, it's a much broader definition, meaning the desire for kind of low pleasures. So the pleasures that we get from sensible objects like cake and wine and Netflix. And this is in opposition to high desires, which would be things like the desire for truth, the desire for God. So when Adam sinned, he lost the power to suspend the natural law of communication between mind and body. So this explains our sad, fallen state. We, like fallen Adam, cannot escape the pulls and demands that are connected to our sensory experience. But then, how did Adam sin? He had the power to arrest his sensible inputs. Why did he not do that when he was being tempted? So Malebranche starts by saying, well, it is natural to love pleasure and to enjoy it, and that was not forbidden to Adam. So he was allowed to get pleasure in the cake and the wine. However, Adam did not feel a similar kind of pleasure when he loved God, because he knew that he had to love God. He didn't feel like he had to. Adam had clear knowledge that God is the good. And so in loving God, Adam felt an intellectual, not a sensible joy. So it was a different kind of pleasure and a different kind of joy. So the suggestion here is that when Adam was presented with the promise of a very intense sensory pleasure, the anticipation of enjoying that pleasure crowded out his clear knowledge of God as the good and its attendant intellectual joy. So God, Adam is sort of having this intellectual joy. He's loving God as the good. He has pure knowledge of this. Eve is tempting him. And, we might think, okay, well, maybe the sensible pleasure just snapped that intellectual joy away and replaced it with this anticipation of this sensory pleasure. And so Adam was able to fall in this way. There's a certain plausibility to this account, but it's not the account that Malebranche gives. In fact, he says that these anticipatory pleasures were not the cause of the fall. Because Adam knew, he knew, he didn't just feel it, he knew that only God could make him feel pleasure or joy. So even in the moment of temptation, Adam retained the power to suspend the emotional, anticipatory, sensory pleasure. So why didn't he, right? We come back to this question. Why did he fail to suspend these laws, given how powerful he was? Malebranche's answer is difficult to find. These are hard questions. He kind of buries the discussions a little bit. But to locate it, I have noticed, we can locate his answer when we ask, where's Eve? Where is she in the narrative of the fall? So in his final work, written days before his death, or finished, I should say, days before his death, it's the only manuscript in Malebranche's hand that we still have. It's in Normandy. I've gone to see it, and you can actually see his hand shaking as he finishes the text. It's a very moving experience for a Malebranche scholar. So his last work is called Réflexions sur la prémotion physique, Reflections on Physical Premotion. And they're kind of embedded in a discussion that really has not much to do with our purposes here. He mentions why he thinks Adam sinned. Okay. So he says, or he writes, I believe that Adam could resist the temptation and that God did not physically predetermine him to sin to the consent that he gave to the solicitation of his wife. So here Malebranche is sort of interested in talking about, did God foresee that Adam would have to sin? Did he kind of make the universe, including a sinning Adam. These are all sort of discussions about divine foreknowledge and that kind of thing. But here he tells us how he understands the sort of location of Adam's sin, his consent to Eve. So this is a clear example of what I would like to call an account of transitive temptation. So Eve succumbs to the demon, Adam succumbs to Eve. Eve freely gave into temptation, Adam freely gave into his wife. This is consistent with the accounts we saw with Agustin and Aquinas. But Malebranche is not quite in line with Agustin and Aquinas on this topic of Adam's motivation to give in to Eve, which, recall, they thought had to do with the loneliness he would experience if he didn't have his only companion. Instead, Malebranche states that Adam gave in to Eve because of her sollicitation. And we can understand solicitation in a few different but related ways, including one that has sexual connotations. So Malebranche is at least suggesting that Adam gave in to Eve based on his affective responses to her enticement. And while he doesn't make this point explicit, it's at least implied that he takes Adam's fortitude in the face of this kind of solicitation to be very low. Because Eve's solicitation was enough to minimize his knowledge of God as the good, the intellectual joy that comes with that knowledge, and the power to silence his passions. So I think there's a lot more to say about the tension between Adam's direct line to God and his weakness in this instance, but our focus here is Eve. So we're going to leave Adam to one side here. And now my question is, what did Eve give in to? What were the conditions that motivated her to consent to the demon? So to answer this question, we have to dip into a larger issue about why Malebranche's God, who is totally self-sufficient, would create anything in the first place. God doesn't need anything. Why create anything? For Malebranche, the only plausible reason God could have had for creation is to see his Son incarnate. Because the incarnation occurs in order to relieve some of the stain of original sin, it seems that creation itself, to be worthy of God's action, might require original sin. Without original sin, there would be no reason for the incarnation. So on this point, Malebranche writes, when God created the first Adam, he thought about the second. When he created Eve, he thought about his church. He declared by these acts that his ultimate design was not terrestrial man, profane man, man in his natural state, who has nothing divine or infinite about him, but rather this man God, in who he put his benevolence, and his children adopted and made divine by their leader. So the Adam of Eden was created in order to make the second Adam, Christ, possible. It seems that Malebranche is actually asserting here that Adam's sin is required for the incarnation. It is the man God, not man, who is the objective of creation. Eve's role is different. She is the necessary condition for the creation of God's church. And what I take Malebranche to be articulating here is that Eve, in virtue of her reproductive role, is the vessel that ultimately makes possible a population for God's church. So again, here we see Malebranche in agreement with Aquinas and Agustin with respect to the generative role of Eve. But let's return to the question of Eve's motivation to sin. Malebranche's only comment on the motive that drove Eve to consent comes from a text that is not, at all concerned with the topic of original sin. But in the relevant passage, Malebranche is responding to the claim that we can demonstrate the existence of the external world without appealing to faith. So this is getting pretty metaphysics-y. Bear with me here. What's important is that he's responding to the claim that we can prove the existence of the external world without appealing to faith. So Malebranche, in responding to this possibility, says, well, the only possible reason for God to create is to see his Son incarnate. And for the incarnation to happen, we actually don't need to believe that the external world exists. All we need to believe is that one human being exists. Because the incarnation requires God to join the Word to one person. Well, one man, he says, but one person. If only one person exists, then God could join the Word to him and thus sanctify that man. And there you have the incarnation. This process does not require the existence of any world beyond one man. So from here, Malebranche continues. It is obvious that Eve was only tempted on this basis, that is, the necessity of the union of the Word with creation, that she saw that it was good that man ought to be sanctified and rendered worthy of honoring God by his union with the Word. She saw this when she listened to the demon who told her that she would become like God the moment she ate the forbidden fruit. Here, I take Malebranche to be stating that Eve knew that the creation of the universe depended on the incarnation. In other words, she knew that the only reason why she and anything else existed was in order for someone to become like God. Malebranche is here articulating a view of Eve's consent to the demon on the grounds of nothing less than knowledge of the reason for the creation of the universe. That's big, I think. So for Malebranche, Eve was tempted by the demon because she knew the universe was created for the incarnation. The incarnation requires the union between the Word and a human being. She herself, a human being, was a candidate for the incarnation. With the offer from the demon on the table, all the necessary and jointly sufficient elements for the eventual incarnation were on hand. So nowhere in this passage or the others we've looked at in this section does Malebranche suggest that Eve's inferiority was the cause of her giving in to temptation. While wanting to be like God is of course connected to being puffed up with pride, it's important that this desire is linked to knowledge. The knowledge that the union of human to God is required for God's purpose to be fulfilled. Unlike Adam, whose sin was motivated by the solicitation of his wife, Eve ate the forbidden fruit because she had knowledge of the only condition under which the creation of the universe made sense, the incarnation. So while Malebranche agrees with Agustin and Aquinas that Eve, and thus women, play an important role in generation and reproduction, nowhere does he state that their intellectual or moral sense is inherently inferior to men's. Indeed, there's even the suggestion that Eve was in part motivated to succumb to the devil on the basis of knowledge. Okay, so maybe you're following me so far, but now we have to have some real talk. Malebranche says some terrible things about women. So how do we make sense of that? That's the next part. Okay, what does he say? So at the beginning, I mentioned that some recent commentators lump Malebranche in with the best hits of 17th century sexists. Here are a couple of examples. So Catherine Hammerton says, Malebranche presented the female mind as deeply, inherently, essentially sexed. Patricia Springboard says Malebranche went so far as to postulate different structures of mind between the sexes. In a moment, I will kind of take a minute to go through a kind of pretty bad piece of text that both Springborg and Hammerton are using when they articulate these claims. But before we get there, I want to show you two other pieces of text that could also be candidates for being very unfriendly to women. Okay, so the ordinary conversation children are obliged to have with their nurses or even their mothers, who often have no education, completes the process of corrupting and destroying their minds. These women talk nothing but nonsense or ridiculous and frightening tales. They speak to them only of sense-perceptible things and in such a way as to confirm them in the false judgments of sense. In a word, they cast into their minds the seeds of all their own weaknesses, such as their extravagant fears, their ridiculous superstitions, and similar defects. Accordingly, the child, neither accustomed to nor desirous of seeking the truth, finally becomes incapable of discerning it, of making any use of his reason. All right, so this sounds bad. Malebranche is considering the ways that young children's brains are negatively affected by being surrounded by their mothers and nurses, who are most often women. So children's brains are affected by this company because women deal only in nonsense. But despite, on the surface, it reading like an indictment of women, I actually don't think this passage is unfriendly to feminism or a feminist reading of Malebranche, because Malebranche indicates very clearly the reason for the nonsense of mothers and nurses: lack of education. He does not appeal to any intrinsic weakness of the mind. All right, let's look at another one here. So one very often finds minds of two very different temperaments. One sort always wishes to believe blindly, while the other always wishes to see clearly. The first, having almost never used their mind, indiscriminately believe whatever is told to them. The others, always wishing to use their minds even in matters that infinitely surpass them, have indiscriminate contempt for all kinds of authorities. The first are normally stupid and weak minds, such as women and children. The others are haughty and libertine ones, such as heretics and philosophers. Okay, so the philosophers part, that's a topic for a different talk, maybe. We can come back to that in the Q&A. But here, Malebranche outlines the worst kind of minds. But notice that children and women who have stupid and weak minds are stupid and weak because they have never used their minds, not because they cannot use their minds, or cannot use their minds for the purpose of learning. I wish to also underline Malebranche's choice of words here. It's important that he writes of children, in the French enfants, having stupid and weak minds, and not girls, which in the French would be filles. If he were interested in making the claim that women have minds that are inherently stupid and weak, he would have said filles and not enfant. By using enfant, Malebranche signals that he takes all children's minds to be weak. And he tells us why. They've never used them. They haven't used them yet. We can thus infer why women are weak, but not men. They remain like children because they never use their minds. They're not given the occasion. So this leaves open the possibility that if given the opportunity to use their minds, women would be less stupid and weak. Okay, so here's the big one. This is the text that Hamerton and Springborn both point to when stating that Malebranche thinks that women are essentially weaker with a different structure of the mind from men. So he writes, this delicacy of the brain fibers, which is to say the delicacy that blocks searching for truth, is usually found in women. Normally, they are incapable of penetrating to truths that are slightly difficult to discover. Everything abstract is incomprehensible to them. They cannot use their imagination for working out complex and tangled questions. They consider only the surface of things, and their imagination has insufficient strength and insight to pierce it to the heart, comparing all the parts without being distracted. A trifle is enough to distract them. The slightest cry frightens them. The least motion fascinates them. The style and not the reality of things suffices to occupy their minds to capacity. Because insignificant things produce great motions in the delicate fibers of their brains, these things necessarily excite great and vivid feelings in their souls, completely occupying it. So how do we make sense of this text? Here, I want to underline again what Malebranche doesn't say. He does not frame women's inaptitude in untangling complex questions in terms of intrinsic differences in their brains. Notice, too, that he says the softness of brain is usually found in women, and that they're normally unable to seek the truth. What Malebranche is doing here, I submit to you, is taking note of the way that most women are, and not the way that they must be, given their natures. And I think the paragraphs that follow this block of text serve to confirm this point. Malebranche writes that while a delicacy of brain fibers explains why some people react very strongly to sensory stimuli, which impedes the search after truth, it's not at all certain that the delicacy of brain fibers is to be found in all women. And he says there are learned women, courageous women, women capable of anything. And on the other hand, one finds men who are soft and effeminate, incapable of penetrating or accomplishing anything. And so he continues. When we attribute certain defects to a sex, to certain ages, to certain stations, we mean only that it is ordinarily true, always assuming that there's no general rule without exceptions. He continues, noting that we must not assume that all men, all women, all nationalities, all families share the same brain constitution. And so just as we need not hastily suppose an essential identity between things between which we see no differences, so we need not posit essential differences where we do not find perfect identity. He ends by stating, what can be said of the brain fibers is that normally they are very soft and very delicate in children, that with age they become hardened and strengthened. However, most women's and some men's remain extremely delicate throughout their lives. Nothing is known of further determinations. And so Malebranche is claiming, first, no general rule that stipulates that women's brains are softer. Second, there's no reason to claim an essential difference between, for example, men and women, just because we do not find perfect biological identity between them. And third, brains are soft in childhood and become less delicate for both men and women with age. He suggests that while we can observe by their behavior that many adults of both sexes retain delicate brain fibers through adulthood, nothing is known of further determinations. In other words, we just don't know how it all works, and so we have to be content with the empirical evidence before us. So where we see, for instance, sexual difference, we must not hastily suppose essential difference. What's more, I think there's strong reason to believe that Malebranche is endorsing the view that education and experience are the keys to developing a brain that is well suited to searching for truth, not sex, not gender, or I would say, he does not say it, but it seems consistent with his view that not even class or race. To see this point, consider one final passage. Malebranche writes, differences in age and sex are additional principal causes of the difference in men's passions. Children do not like the same things that grown men and old folk do, or they do not like them with the same strength and constancy. Women are often involved only with their family and neighborhood, whereas men are involved with their whole country. Malebranche is here outlining the way that age and sex affect our passions. Young people have different passions because they have fewer experiences of the world. They also have not had enough time to develop passions that are steadfast and strong, on his view. Women's passions are determined by their environments, which are restricted to the home and the neighborhood. By contrast, men's passions are determined by a much larger domain, their whole country. Thus, the number and kind of experiences that men will have will be much greater, and that will change the way that they think about the world. So in short, differences in dispositions are explained in terms of great differences in the occupations and circumstances in which we find ourselves. So it's these occupations and circumstances that result in different dispositions. So when Malebranche writes about the weakness of women's brains, I think he's talking about the de facto state of women. Given their exclusion from education and experience of the world, their brains just don't have the opportunity to develop. In other words, in his comments about women's brains, Malebranche is making a descriptive claim about how things are and not a claim about how things must be. So taking Malebranche's comments about women and his comments about Eve, I think yield a surprising result. It is morally required to educate women. So by way of conclusion, let's see how. So in this section, I want to emphasize 2 points. First, Malebranche thinks that Adam alone is responsible for original sin. And second, that Malebranche's view of Eve's role in the biologico-reproductive propagation of original sin opens room in his system for mitigating the transfer of original sin. So we start with the following question for Malebranche. How is sin inherited? So Malebranche thinks that a mother's brain traces are communicated to her baby in utero. He holds that a baby's soul is joined to its body at the moment of conception. And from the moment that the body of the fetus is ensouled, the baby or the soul has inclinations in response to what's happening in its mother's brain. Because its mother is corrupt, because we're all corrupt, Malebranche says the fetus is corrupt. This is because as soon as the baby is conceived, it's influenced by the disordered imaginings of its mother. The mother's imaginings are disordered because she inherited the brain traces of her mother, who was also disordered, and so on back to Eve. So children are sinners as soon as they're conceived, on his view. But Malebranche is worried about this explanation. Here's the problem. If original sin is transmitted by the communication between mother and child, then the mother, not the father, is responsible for the transmission of original sin. This is a problem for Malebranche because, he says, St. Paul teaches us that original sin entered the world through man. And Malebranche does not want to be in disagreement with St. Paul. So in order to make Adam responsible and not Eve, or, more responsible for original sin, Malebranche offers the following assessment of the relative roles of men and women in communicating original sin to future generations. So he says both are causes of original sin, but each in different ways. So women are responsible because it is through them that sin is communicated. Women bear children. Men are responsible because, as he says, it is man's action is the cause of woman's fecundity or of the communication between the woman and her child. So put another way, man is responsible for fertilizing woman, making him the ultimate cause of the communication between her mind and the mind of the child. And the woman is the proximate cause of the communication itself. Women are thus the communicators of sin, but without Adam's action, there would be no sin to communicate. Well, that's interesting. This raises another question. If without Adam's action there would be no sin to communicate, how does Malebranche understand Eve's sin, which happened before Adam's? So the way the story goes in the garden, Eve sins first. And it seems like without Adam's fertilizing Eve, there would be no communication of original sin. Well, this is strange. Bear with me. There's one more long passage, but it's so astonishing that I think it's worth reading in full. Here's Malebranche. I cannot be persuaded that the woman after her sin should have lost the power she had over her body unless her husband had also sinned. Eve felt no involuntary or rebellious impulses immediately after her sin. She did not feel the shame in being seen naked. She did not conceal herself. Rather, she drew near her husband, although he was naked like her. Her eyes were not yet opened. She was, as before, the absolute mistress of her body. Order has it that immediately after her sin, her soul was troubled by the rebellion of her body and by the shame of her and her husband's nakedness. For it was not just that God should any longer suspend the laws of communication of motion in her favor, but because her body belonged to her husband, and because her husband was still in a state of innocence, she received no punishment through this body. This punishment was deferred until he himself had eaten of the fruit that she gave him. So Eve's experiences in the time between her consent to the demon, but before Adam's, are extraordinary to imagine. On Malebranche's account, presumably she was endowed with knowledge once she consented to the demon. She maintained total control over her body, despite the fact that according to relations of moral perfection, she should have already been feeling shame and other kinds of emotions. Nevertheless, she remained absolute mistress of her body, which suggests that in the pre-fallen state, Eve, just like Adam, had ultimate power over the way that her body affected her mind. So she was in a state of augmented knowledge as well as unaffected by distraction or punishment from the body. So we might wonder why in this state she went over to Adam at all, right? I mean, big knowledge, all this power, and she went back to Adam. Malebranche doesn't tell us why. In the event, however, she went to Adam to solicit him into consenting to her invitation to sin. But notice that on this account, it looks like Eve's action was sufficient to usher in original sin. After all, she consented to the demon. To block this conclusion and preserve the narrative that Adam is, the ultimate origin of sin, Malebranche resorts to a metaphysically dubious argument that Adam's ownership of Eve's body blocked the punishment she deserved. But I think it's interesting to note that if we follow Malebranche, if Eve had not solicited Adam, she would have remained sin-free, mistress of her body, maybe had impeccable children. Anyway, amazing to imagine. Why'd she go back? I don't know. Okay, so Malebranche thus concludes that, properly speaking, it's Adam's fault that original sin happened because it was his sin that caused the deprivation of power over the body. So in speaking in terms of first parents, sin originates in Adam, communicated through Eve. But again, note that Malebranche refrains from stating that there's any essential difference that explains this power dynamic between them. Sure, he says that Adam owns Eve's body, which prevents her from ushering in original sin, but this ownership, of course, in itself does not entail any essential difference between person owned and person owning. As we've seen, on Malebranche's view, we inherit original sin from our first parents. But in what exactly does this inheritance consist? Malebranche is clear that strong concupiscence is an effect of original sin, but he's just as clear that our concupiscent impulses can be lessened, and that not all of us are equally driven to satisfy these urges. If Malebranche thinks that fathers, with Adam at their origin, transfer let's say a fixed and immutable amount of concupiscence, perhaps through something like what we would today call a gene, if we imagine that men transfer a fixed amount of concupiscence to their children, then maybe the way that women communicate sin to their children can mitigate the amount of original sin or the damage of original sin that babies have. So if we assume that dampening the effects of original sin as far as is possible is a good thing, it seems that there's one path to make the transmission less pernicious. Make women's brains better. Make women's brains less corrupt. So as I mentioned above, Malebranche seems to think that the de facto state of women's brains is one of inferiority and corruption. There's nothing in his discussion to suggest that women, or even their first mother, Eve, are unable to learn, or that they exist in a necessary or essential state of weakness. So at the outset of the search after truth, Malebranche states that error is the cause of all misery. The way to avoid error and search for truth is to become attentive to clear ideas. And such attention is so powerful that it changes the brain. Attention literally shapes the fibers of the brain in a way that makes it more conducive to learn. So we're all born at a deficit in this regard. Our inheritance of original sin means we're born with concupiscence, which is the central obstacle on Malebranche's view to searching for truth. But what we've seen in the preceding discussion is that there's nothing in Malebranche's comments on Eve, or women more generally, that suggests that the communication of concupiscence is fixed. All he tells us is that corrupt inclinations are transmitted from mother to fetus in utero. And given that Malebranche strongly suggests that education and experience determine our dispositions, and that there's nothing blocking women from developing different dispositions, I contend that his system is not only friendly to, but even entails that women, or at least future mothers, ought to be educated. With education, women will be better able to moderate their imaginations and their passions, and thus minimize the damage done to their babies by having fewer corrupt inclinations. There's no suggestion here that Malebranche thinks that concupiscence could be educated out of the human race. I think on his view, it is our inescapable inheritance, but it does seem possible by his own lights to ameliorate the minds of women in order to make the transmission less destructive to the ultimate goals of training children to attend, reflect, and meditate. I think that Malebranche then should not be lumped in with the best hits of early modern misogynists. Despite his intellectual backdrop of medieval misogyny, he followed his philosophical method to determine the nature of women's minds and found that they were wanting not due to nature, but due to opportunity. His treatment of Eve, likewise, contains no indictment of her weaker nature. So Malebranche is not progressive enough to call for the education of women as a good in itself. However, I do think that it is consistent with and morally required by his system that society should ensure that pregnant women have the least disordered minds possible, if not for their sake, then for the sake of the future of humankind. Thank you.
This is more of a clarifying question, I guess, but and maybe you said it, but and I'm gonna be, like you've said the name so many times.
Malebranche.
I just like to say it.
You can just say
does he,
or Nicholas.
give any account to why Satan, in his account to why Satan chooses Eve? It goes to Eve first instead of Adam, because I feel like that would be, that's also like, I was just curious.
Yeah, so. Oh, it's a really good question. So I have spent a lot of time with the volumes in the 20-volume collection. From what I can tell, he mentions Eve 6 times. Okay. And he mentions Adam like 12,000 times, right? So I have given you effectively everything he says about, even her name being mentioned, even like woman doesn't happen very much. So he does not give an account of why the serpent. So he, unlike Aquinas and Agustin, who are like, he went for the weak one, it doesn't exist. So that's really nice, because that omission is also worth pointing out in these discussions. Thank you. Hey, how's it going?
Hi. I was wondering, like, he gives long treatments on, like, how Eve must have known this or that, or like Adam's susceptible to this or that, and he says that like Eve's actions were like necessary for incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
But does he like talk about like if that was the purpose of the universe, then like why the devil is like how the devil's actions like and motivations fit into that?
Another really good question. So I have not found in Malebranche's work a discussion of the motive of Satan. I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, I think, so one of the things that is, I think, relevant here is that despite being a theologian, the vast majority of Malebranche's works were oriented towards better understanding the human condition. Now, of course, Satan's story is intimately related to how we got to where we are in his view, but the motivation of the fallen angel is not something I have at least come across that he discusses.
Is it like, do any of his contemporaries treat things like that, or no?
None that come to mind. Wait, is somebody whispering something?
Just a Milton.
Oh, Milton, right. Well, right. So as far as like philosophers, philosophers in the early modern period do talk about Eve and they talk about Adam. Again, I can't speak for all of it, but I have not found a discussion of the motivation of the fallen angel per se. That's a really good question. That's a good research project. If anyone's looking for one. Ninotska, yeah.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for the talk. I was just very intrigued by the fact that you mentioned that they wanted to have like someone to like the incarnation of Jesus and blah blah blah. I honestly never thought about that before.
Me neither, yeah.
But further, when you explained that, Eve and their children and carrying like this main scene, how do you feel about the fact that Eve was coming from Adam, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's like that interpersonal connection or like that connection within himself. Like if she was the one who committed the sin, wouldn't Adam be accountable as well, like immediately just because she's sort of like her daughter, his wife, you know?
Yeah.
She's coming from his body. So how do you feel about that?
I mean, so this is, so we're getting to some like biblical interpretation here. And I think, so one way to think about Eve's existence is insofar as she is pulled from the side or the rib of Adam, she is necessarily subordinate to him and so forth. There are other scholars who read it in different ways. For instance, bone is better than dust. Adam is created sort of from dust, dirt, the earth, and Eve is created from a bone. And so some scholars would say, well, look, I mean, she actually is created from a material that is nobler than what Adam is created from. So, I mean, whether or not here's another way of putting your question maybe is like, are parents responsible for the sins of their children? I mean, maybe it depends on how old they are, but by the time that Eve and Adam are sort of in the sinning territory, you would think that she's her own person. But that link that tethers her to Adam through her origin story definitely makes things complicated with respect to her ontological status as like a discrete individual being who kind of has a whole story of her own. And of course, the way that we tell this story, or the story is told to us, doesn't actually give her a three-dimensional character in the story. She's sort of a foil or a dupe that kind of ushers in this next phase of the story. So I think disentangling how to understand her as an individual player in this story, would be very interesting. It's not something I've done, but it's a great question. Thank you. Hey.
I'm really interested in Malebranche in his speculation about brains, and
you would be, yes, of course.
I would be, and the idea that the structures and the ideas and whatever is ingrained in the brain of the parents is then inherited by the children. And I was wondering, I noticed that, of course, because it seems to really anticipate some of the texts that I know well from the 19th century, specifically Lamarck's theory of inherited characteristics. And I'm just wondering a few things. Is this theory, this stuff on the brains, was this unique to Malebranche? Is this his own speculation, something that's really kind of unique to him? Was he working with other sources, or was this a kind of common theory at the time? And then also, are there people who have linked his theories to later 19th century theories of inherited characters?
Yeah, so to take the questions in order, no, he is not the originator of this theory. He's following Descartes. So Descartes' Passions of the Soul is really the place where we get a more kind of fleshed out view of the way that Descartes understands anatomy. So just very briefly, the view is that there are very fine, so when we talk about animal spirits, spirit in like the alcohol sense, like liquor, like very, very fine liquor that you couldn't see with the naked eye, but maybe with like a very sophisticated lens, you might be able to see it. And that these liquids connect sensory experience to the brain. So in Descartes' works, there's a very, an illustration that I love of like a little person over a fire, a person who appears to be nude, I don't know why, but over a fire with their foot in the fire. And it shows the flames touching the foot, and then there's a diagram of the animal spirits being sort of like, oh no, right? They're like excited by that sensory touch, and the spirits flow super fast to the brain to signal pain and to, tell the person to move their foot. And so this is how Descartes tries to explain the hinterland between the soul and the body. And so Descartes is trying very hard, he's famous for arguing that the mind and the body are totally distinct. But of course, everybody's like, okay, but, when I'm hungry, I can't think about math. And like when I put my foot in the fire, how does my mind know that that I'm feeling pain? And so the theory of animal spirits is postulated in order to try to explain, it doesn't work. Maybe that's obvious from but what he eventually says is that wherever the soul is, it's probably somewhere like in this zone. He thinks that the pineal gland at the back of the brain is the gateway between the body and the mind. And that the animal spirits all kind of go towards the pineal gland, and that the pineal gland is like a little gate. And depending on what the animal spirits are doing, it like opens the gate and like solicits the relevant idea. But of course, this just pushes the problem back and back and back. There's no eventual explanation for what the interface between the immaterial world and the material world are. That's more than you bargained for. So yes, Malebranche is taking it wholesale from Descartes. With respect to people looking at Malebranche's physiology in the 19th century, I don't know. And I think the place to look is Francophone scholars, contemporary, and 20th century Francophone scholars, because the Anglophone world, with respect to their interest in Malebranche, is heavily focused on metaphysics and epistemology. His ethics, writings on women, writings on science. Anglophone thinkers are not yet there with respect to kind of looking at those parts of his texts. But there are many French language edited volumes of Malebranche's works and his influence, especially in France. So I would, yeah. But we can talk more. I might even have some in my office, so yeah.
Julie, you did a great job. It was so interesting.
Oh, thank you.
But could I ask one question about, I'll try to make it quick, about Malebranche's language, his use of language. I'd be very curious to look at the French. It isn't French, the French
Yes.
text. But in the English translation, and I wonder if the students notice this too, he's very forceful and even absolutist in some of his phrasing. Everything abstract is incomprehensible to them, he says about women. Wishing to use their minds even in matters that infinitely surpass them. The language that he uses, it seems so strong that it's a little hard for me to accept entirely your claim that he doesn't see an intrinsic difference between male and female brains.
Yeah, well, so I'm not sure how to respond to that. So I think, yes, the language is strong. There's no question. I'm trying to think of a nice way to say this. I mean, think about the way that we sometimes describe the behavior of children. Right. We can use very strong language to give a descriptive account of their inability to make sense of the world, or their irrational behavior in light of that inability, right? Because they haven't yet had the relevant experiences, their brains are not fully developed. And so it's not outside the realm of possibility, from my perspective, that a person like Malebranche could use similar language to describe women if he thinks that women are like children, which I think he does. And so children, like women, have all sorts of incapacities with respect to understanding the world and doing geometry and that kind of thing. So the fact that he groups women and children together, but he obviously thinks that children can grow out of it, I think gives me hope for the line of reasoning that I'm interested in developing. And I would just say as an aside that, one of the early questions asked if Malebranche or other early moderns talk about Satan or, one of Malebranche's close contemporaries, Spinoza, talks about Eve, and Spinoza, in no uncertain terms, actually, contemporary Spinoza scholars call it the black page, to mean the page they wish he had never written, because it is so filled with horrible misogyny, and many scholars have taken time to try to figure out how to make sense of what he's saying, to make it seem less bad. But there are early modernists who very clearly will say, the rational mind, everybody can learn, blah, blah, blah. But women have to submit. And that is their role, that is their place, and society cannot work unless women submit, and that is their duty. So it's not as though there weren't people in this era kind of lauding the rational mind while simultaneously reminding women where their place is in society. So that's an incomplete answer, but that's my first stab. Yeah. Even then.
Just to build on this very question, so in the very beginning of the talk, I study Eastern literatures and philosophy, and the things that are said in Buddhism can be really shocking too. But in the beginning of the talk, you said something about God in man, or all in God, and there was some kind
of... The vision of all things in God?
Yeah, the vision of all things in God. So I guess what I was wondering is if the vision of all things in God, doesn't that mean that has to include women as one of these things? I just wonder if you could just say a little bit, I know it's a long talk, but about this vision.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so...
help us with this problem.
I don't think so, but I'm still going to say some stuff about it because it's super cool. So this is actually part of why when I mentioned that Malebranche loves Descartes but thinks Descartes isn't theological enough, this is one of the things he takes from Agustin and builds into a Cartesian system. So the idea is that when I look at you, I have an idea of you, but actually on Malebranche's view, it's incorrect to say I have the idea. I'm seeing you in God. And so the human mind, on his view, is not a repository for ideas. Instead, given certain causal conditions, God reveals ideas to us. And so we see them in him. So this is Malebranche taking very seriously Augustin's point that you shall not be a light unto yourself. Yeah. But again, if all things being equal, epistemology for everyone, women in principle, women do see everything that they see in God, and there's no like veiled off portion of God's mind given, your sex or gender or whatever. Yeah. At least as far as he tells. Yeah. Aileen, yeah.
I am wondering, you've traced obviously a very compelling case between his competition with Descartes and Aquinas. But we're in the 17th century where you could say basically the heyday of the salonière, of women like Scudéry, of plays like Molière's L'École des Femmes that really actively reflects on education and what women are capable of knowing and the question of ignorance of women. And you have in salon culture a number of theologians coming and talking and discussing. So I wonder if it's useful for you to put him more in the context of that moment, of like a Madame de Maintenon opening her school in Saint-Cyr and thinking about preparing young women for the world and getting them out of a state of ignorance. So have you, and do you think it's useful, or is it more useful to stay within the question of Eve and the...
So I think I think it's very useful, if only to emphasize Malebranche's utter isolation from that entire world. And I think it's useful to, or it would be useful to kind of frame this in the context of this burgeoning intellectual sphere for women, one that, from what I can tell, Malebranche had zero connection to. So he lived an incredibly ascetic life, and in Paris, but he wasn't fully cloistered, but I mean, the way his biographer tells it is that he would sometimes walk the Rive Gauche and ask the bookseller what's new, and the bookseller would be like, something posthumous from Descartes, and he'd like get the book and go back to his room and read it. So, I mean, I don't have, or at least I don't know enough about his personal life to know what kind of social context.
Correspondence with major women of his time, or
No.
members of the court.
No. So would he have been aware that this was in the air? It seems hard to believe no, but there's just no evidence of him engaging with it. Yeah. At least that I mean, maybe it's out there, but I take the point and I will look. Thank you. Yeah.
So when you're treating this as a whole, like you were talking about like this as like the history of misogyny and how his words can be used to frame like maybe a shift in that. What sort of role are you hoping to argue that his work had in like the shifts of historical misogyny?
That's a good question. So, as somebody who works on the history of philosophy, I mean, my first answer is going to be sort of a silly, not non-satisfying answer. I think for my purposes, it's a good in itself to get it right. And just to figure out what is the text telling us, and what makes sense given his overall system. But you're asking a more practical question, right? Which is, okay, let's say we get him right. What can that tell us about the early modern world? What can that tell us about attitudes about women in this period? And, just kind of also in response to Hélène's question, what can this tell us about his connection to or disconnection from other movements in his city at the time? And I think, to me, it is exciting to imagine a person, Malebranche is not, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say Malebranche is like cutting edge. That's not a phrase that's maybe ever been uttered in the history of the world. And because his stuff is so theological, it's very steeped in God, it's very metaphysical, there's no attention to these other parts of his texts. And I think that in order to get a better understanding of who this thinker was and what they wanted to do, we need to understand all parts of the text. And in understanding these less studied parts of the text, my hope is that we can actually start to create a map of the early modern world, starting in Paris and in France and looking to other parts of Europe to see how these, we think of these as these like fusty, cloistered, particular older men who are priests and they do metaphysics and they don't go to parties. I think it's interesting to think like, what was changing their minds? And, as I mentioned, Malebranche was very widely read by women through the Enlightenment. And what did they pick up from his texts? What was going on there? So if we're interested in being like the cartographers of early modern intellectual history, I think this is an important node to kind of get a better sense of what was going on. Allison.
Do you think Malebranche might have believed that even though there is no difference in essence between men and women, do you think he could have thought, but obviously there's a difference in degree of ability to learn and know, which explains why the women don't exercise their minds and why they don't have these experiences that you're pointing out. It kind of leaves the door open for being a difference just in experience, and being deprived of education explains the difference. But it seems to be equally possible, and sorry to say, likely maybe that he thought there's a difference in degree that would be sufficient to explain difference in degree of ability. That would be sufficient to explain why the world looked the way it did.
Yeah, so I mean, he doesn't ever say it. And I mean, we can't build an entire thesis on the absence of a claim. Well, maybe we can. Well, anyway, I mean, we want something more than just he didn't say it. But the pieces of text that I drew your attention to are the places where he would have said it, I think, if he thought it.
Well, but so he's saying, well, the women, they don't have education, and so, but maybe he's assuming as a sort of suppressed premise there that, as we all know, it's pretty pointless to educate them the way we educate men. So, of course, women without education, right? So I'm just wondering if it might have seemed like to him obvious that there's a difference in degree, even if there isn't a difference in essence.
Yeah, I mean, so I would want to push pretty hard on the passage where he says, well, look, there are women who are courageous, and I can't remember the adjectives exactly, but, there are women who have these properties, and there are men who fail to have the sort of typical male properties that we see. And so this suggests that there's no kind of essential rule, and it can kind of go either way. And I think there, I suppose you could say, well, if you see a courageous woman or two, maybe those are the exceptions that prove the rule, or so. But it strikes me that claim speaks against this idea that there's a difference in degree of ability.
Well, but we say things like men typically have more upper body strength than women, though there are some women, weightlifters who are stronger than 99% of men, right? So, but we still might say, well, typically there's a trend, right? So that's why I'm thinking that it is striking that he's not saying there's a difference in essence or kind, right?
Yeah.
So that's radical. It's super interesting. But then I wonder if it's followed by the maybe kind of depressing thought that he just thought, okay, so there's a range and there's variation in the range, but typically these differences arise.
Yeah, so it seems like I think the comparison between like the features of a physical body as an analogy for the features of the mind, I don't think that would quite work. Partly because it seems like Malebranche, when he's talking about women and women's relative intelligence, he's taking just evidence, I should say, empirical evidence about how women are. And I think you can't actually, he was unable to sort of see the mind or see anything internal to women that would suggest that there's a difference in degree. Whereas when you think about differences in bodies, you have lots more evidence about kinds of bodies and the distribution of the way bodies are. And so, I mean, this to me is this is getting a little more in the weeds, but Malebranche is thought to be a rationalist philosopher, which means that he takes ideas to be sort of pre-experiential. And as a rationalist philosopher, I think he could have said women are just not, by degree or by their essential features, are just not able to do it. And he doesn't say that. And instead, he seems to rely on empirical observation to kind of gather his evidence about how women are, which seems very contrary to the Malebranche some of those in the community, the way that we understand him or we understand his process. So So I think, anyway, I've said a lot there, but I think, it would be strange, I think, for him to hold it without saying it. And I think the evidence suggests, or at least the text suggests to me, that he's working on empirical evidence of how women are, and not a kind of more metaphysical sense of, that their abilities are limited in some sort of, sex-related way. But we can fight more about this later. Oh, yeah. Oh,
Can I ask one question? Is that okay?
do we have time for one more?
You just answered one of my questions about what his philosophical methodology is, because you mentioned, I think, with admiration, that by following his own philosophical operation, he ends up in a place where his contemporaries aren't. But I'm wondering if you've gotten whiffs of other topics that, if you pursued them, would lead you to the same conclusion, that by following empiricism, as relative to rationalism, that he ends up in a place that, I don't know, might seem progressive from our point of view, or at least different from his peers.
Yeah, so, I think your question touches on a very important moment that is currently happening in studies of early modern philosophy. So we usually separate thinkers into rationalist and empiricist camps when we talk about the empiricists are no ideas in the mind before experience. The rationalists are the ideas are all there and experience might excite them, but mind is chock full storehouse of ideas. One of the things that's been happening as more thinkers become interested in questions like the one that we've all been thinking about for the past couple of hours, as thinkers start to bring women who were writing in that period back into the conversation, people of color back into the conversation, it's become more and more evident that those categories are obviously artificial, in some senses arbitrary, and maybe in all senses totally unhelpful for understanding the currents of methodology through the period. So when we look at a figure like Descartes or like Malebranche and say, well, these are the paragons of rationalism, and we look at John Locke and David Hume and say, these are the empiricists, and the empiricists came to save the day from the rationalists, and we start to lose interesting avenues of investigation when we look at John Locke and we're like, well, he thinks that the mind has dispositions at birth. That doesn't sound very empiricism-y. Or Malebranche seems to take the kind of factual evidence of how women are to ground his claims about women. And so we're starting to sort of see that these categories just cannot do the work we thought they could do, and that instead, and that actually sometimes can serve as obstacles for us noticing these other interesting features of philosophers' work. Unfortunately, I'm one of those people who has spent most of my research life looking at the metaphysics and epistemology, and I want to change, because I think that these questions, in some cases, were even more important to them than the metaphysical and epistemological questions, but they force us to disband or destroy some of these categorical assumptions of who these thinkers are and how they did what they did. So I'll let you know if I find anything else.
Is that it, everyone? Thank you
Thank you.
so much.
Thank you.